Now that we have the interface all figured out and know how to start projects, let's talk about actually creating some primitives in 3D Studio, how we can actually build these and use the various properties of them to edit them to our liking. So what I'm actually going to do is create a basic still life purely from primitives and with some very simple modifiers added to recreate in a very simple way some of the objects in the still life. And I obtained this photo from emptyeasel.com, and it's really useful for this example because we've got some very simple spheres here. We can talk about how to create this bowl and then move on to more interesting objects like the glass and even the paper airplane. We'll probably leave out the stapler in this example, but let's see how we can create this just from very basic shapes in 3D Studio. The first thing I need to do then is to actually create a brand new project, and I'm going to go to my application menu, go to manage and select set project folder. I'll then navigate to the location where I'm going to create this project folder. It's very important to do this each time so that all of your files are nicely organized and kept together. And I'll call this still life. And that's gone ahead and created a hierarchy of folders called still life, and scenes is where I'll be saving my individual max files to. So when you're in 3D Studio, there are several ways to create primitive geometry, and the first way would be through the create menu, and what we'll start with are standard primitives. And you can see we've got box, cone, sphere, etc. Just these different primitive shapes. And the easier way to do it though is through the actual creation panel here on the right hand side. And you'll notice it's this little kind of star symbol. And underneath that we've got a number of different types of objects that we can create. Geometry, shapes, lights, cameras, helpers, space warps, and then systems. Underneath that, so if I want to do geometry, for example, we'll see a drop-down menu with subcategories of geometry. Standard primitives, extended primitives, etc. We could even create mental ray nodes and nerve surfaces here. Then, underneath standard primitives, we have a rollout here, which is just the same listing of standard primitives that we store under the create menu here. So let's start by creating a sphere to represent one of the pieces of fruit in our still life. What I'll do then is just click on sphere, and I'm going to click and drag to create that primitive. So what exactly is a primitive? Well, essentially it's just a collection of polygons, or in this case quads, that are being put together to build a basic shape or a primitive shape. You know, in 3D space, the simplest thing you can create is a simple polygon, which is a three-sided shape. But primitives are more useful because it's easier to start with a foundation, like a sphere or a box, and then you can apply modifiers to cut them up or move vertices around, etc. So I've created my sphere, and you'll notice that as soon as I created that, what happened was additional parameters appeared in the creation tab here. Now everything gets assigned a name by default, in this case sphere 1. So why don't I go and rename this to something like Apple 01. And each object that you create in 3D Studio has a unique color applied to it by default, and that gets displayed here. So if we just double click on that color, we can assign a color to it by default. So why don't we go ahead and apply a red to this. You can save these by adding a custom color and clicking add color, and it adds it in here to our custom color set. But I think in this example I like this initial red that I found here, so I'll click on OK, and that changes the color of my object. Now it'll maintain this color until I apply a material to it or a texture map for rendering. More importantly than this though are the parameters that appear, and what these are the different parameters that get placed into the equations that were calculated when the primitive was built. And particularly we've got this radius option here, so I can click to increase the radius or decrease the radius, or if I like I can click and hold and I can drag it interactively to change the size of my shape. You'll notice this segments section here, and most primitives have this option to change the amount of detail or the number of polygons that make up the shape. So if I full screen my perspective viewport so you can see it a little better, that's Alt and W. If I go to Wireframe View by clicking on Realistic, going down to Wireframe, you can see the number of polygons that by default we use to create this object. Now this is too high detail for me. All I can do is just click and drag and lower the number of segments that make up the shape. I can even take it all the way down so it just becomes something as simple as this, or bring it all the way back up again. Let's start with something like 20. You always want to be careful in 3D not to exaggerate the amount of detail on the object until you really need it. It really is the case of less is more. It's going to be easier to work with this model if you keep the number of segments or the number of polygons down to a lower level to begin with, and then you can increase them when it comes to rendering. So I'm going to keep my segments at this by default. If I switch back to Realistic View, you'll see this smooth option here. If I uncheck that, you'll see that what it's done is it's changed the way the light interacts with the surface, so you can actually see how these polygons make up this shape. And the smooth option, all that's doing is just blending one color of one polygon into the next, and it's just using a lighting trick to do that. Now you'll notice that this created an object in the center of the scene where I started to click and then dragged out, and it's very much interactive creation by default. Now if you'll notice up here the creation method is set to center, if I set it to edge, because I'm still working in this sphere tool, I can just click and drag somewhere else on the canvas, but you'll notice that it's pulling out from the edge of that sphere this time when I create the new shape. And you can keep doing this to add as many of these spheres as you'd like while you're working in the creation tool. Now I'm just going to undo with Control Z to get back to my original shape. And while you're at it, looking at these object types, explore the different types, box for example, and note the different methods that you use to create them. In this case, I drag out, let go, and then drag up to create the box. Or we can create a torus over here, which is simply a case of dragging up and down spreads it out, and dragging left and right is going to do the same thing. And if I let go and then drag up, you'll notice that I can change the size of the ring in the torus. We have the typical teapot, which is pretty much existed in every piece of 3D software. It was one of the first things created, and so it's kind of become the standard that all applications allow you to create a teapot by default. Planes are a nice way to create objects like, let's see, the paper airplane in our example. It's a little bit simpler than a sphere and than a box, and sometimes an easier starting point. You want to try and pick the shape that best represents the type of object that you're producing. So obviously if I want to create a ball, I don't want to start with a plane or a box. It would make more sense to start with a sphere. But if I'm creating a table, that wouldn't make sense at all. It would make more sense to start with a cube in this case. I'm going to switch to my selection tool, which is actually just this guy here, or I can hit Q on my keyboard, which is the shortcut. I'm just going to pick up these shapes that I don't want for now and just middle mouse my view over. I'd like to show you a geosphere, and when you first create this you might think, well, that's exactly the same as sphere, but the secret lies in when you change the view to wireframe. You'll notice that the way these are constructed are very different. So it's just the algorithms that were used in creating and organizing these polygons to create the object. So this is equally sized tris or triangles, and in this case it's a mixture of quads, and if I rotate around, you can actually see triangles at the top, so we get some pinching at the top of the object. So in some cases it might be better to use a traditional sphere, whereas a geosphere might give you more flexibility when you're adjusting it to create a more complicated object. Now that I've created more than one object, then you might think, well, how do I get back to the previous object if I wanted to change some of these creation parameters? You don't just have to set them once you've created it. I'm actually in creation mode right now, so if I just switch back to my selection tool and pick up one of my previous objects, I can actually go over here to this tab here, which is the Modify tab, and you'll notice I've got Apple 1 selected. It says up here. The modifiers by default just show me that I've created the sphere, and then radius appears here along with the number of segments that I have, so I can adjust those to my liking. I can come back over to the Geosphere, and you'll see that it's changed to Geosphere 1, and again I can adjust the radius and the number of segments that I've got that make up this object. Be sure to explore each of the parameters that are available when you create a new object, and they'll change according to the type of object that you're creating. You'll notice that I can also change the name of the object using the Modify menu, so I could call this something like orange, and I could give it a different color, but before I do that, let me show you one of the unique ways to filter objects or select different objects using 3D Studio. So if I come back to a realistic view, you'll notice these have the same color by default. And if I go to the Edit menu, Select By, and I'm going to select Color at the bottom of this sub-menu, and then ask me to pick a color. If I click on one of these objects, it selects all of the objects that contain that color. So that's a useful way to organize your scene, to pick up objects. You can group them by color, etc. So let's add a custom color to this one, and let's pick something that represents my orange here. Something like that. So I've got my apple here and my orange here, and they're named and created accordingly. One's a sphere and one's a geosphere. Now that I've actually created some geometry with which to build my 3D still life, I have to actually consider how I'm going to position them in 3D space to represent that original image that I had. Let's see, this guy here. So I want to start thinking about how do I move my apple and my orange into place so that they represent this image here. Well, to do that we have to make use of the transform tools, and we can move, rotate and scale. So if I rotate my 3D view around a little bit here, you can see that I've got my default grid, and what I think I might do is actually use that grid as a reference to where my table is going to be, and so I can kind of guess that in the back left hand corner and above that table, that's where I'm going to place my first two objects. Now by default I can just use the select object tool to pick up these individual objects, but that doesn't allow me to move them around. Now the shortcut for the selection tool is Q. The more useful tools in this case are going to be the select and move tool, and that brings up this transform or move tool gizmo, and it allows me to move my object along the three axes that make up 3D space. Now before we actually start moving this around, I should remind you that it's very difficult to tell where your objects are placed if you're just looking at it from a specific view. So the worst thing you can really do is just move an object and then say that's good. You want to be continually using your camera tools to rotate around your view, so you're always aware of exactly where something sits in 3D space. In addition to that, remember to switch in and out of your different viewports, so your top view, your front view, etc., so you can get a quick glimpse at where everything is positioned in 3D space. So in this case, what I'm going to do is pick up my orange, and I can just click on any one of these arrows to transform this object around in 3D space. So I can move it in Y, I can move it in Z to move it up and down, X to move it left and right. I can also use these combination squares here, which allow me to move it, in this case, in both the Z and the X axes at the same time, which is really useful. It's a nice feature. Or I can move it in Y and X at the same time, or Z and Y at the same time. So to begin with, I'm going to move my 3D view around and move this to the back left of that grid where I'm positioning it using that table in my picture. So the next problem that you'll notice is that the scale is completely off, and so I have to reduce this down, and in order to do that I'm going to use the scale tool here. Now you'll notice that this has got several tools buried underneath it if you hold down, and so we have the, if I hover over here, select and uniform scale, and underneath that we have select and non-uniform scale. Underneath that we have select and squash. So I think what I'll use is the select and uniform scale, and that brings up this little scale gizmo, and it works in very much the same way. If I click the Y, you can see I can stretch it out. Control Z to undo. I can do the same in X. I can also do the same in Z. Or again, I can grab two of these axes at the same time to come up with these interesting results. But I want to scale this uniformly, so I'm just going to hover in the middle. You can see I can pick up all the axes at once, and I can scale this down. So I'll start to scale this down. Again, I'm going to move around in 3D space to see where I'm positioning this. Keep looking at my reference image. It's maybe that's pretty close to begin with. I'm going to come back to my move tool and move my object up a bit, and I think that's a good start. Now if I frame in on this object, so I can just come down here to zoom, and I'll do zoom selected, which is this guy here. What if I want to rotate this around? Well, I can make use of my rotate tool in order to do that. Now it doesn't make too much sense with a sphere, but this is just to show you. And I think what I'll do is add edged faces on here so you can see what's going on. The rotate tool, again, it's got that similar color scheme, and I can rotate it in X, Y, and Z. Or if I click on this gray circle, I can rotate it in all three axes at once. And on the very outside you'll see a light grey circle, and that's going to rotate it in relation to your camera, so looking straight down the camera using that as the axis. So that's the rotate tool. Let's zoom out a little bit here. Now I'd like to move and position my apple so that it matches underneath the orange here, just like it does in the example. But rather than doing that in 3D space, I'm going to start making use of my other views. Now, what I'm going to do is switch back to my move tool, but instead of using these shortcuts up here, which I find to be kind of slow, I'm going to use the keyboard. And if you look at the QWERTY keys on your keyboard, Q is selection, W is move, E is rotate, and R is scale. So I'll hit W to go to my move tool. I'll come back out to my 4-up view, and I'll click in my top view and maximize that with Alt W. I think what I'll do then is I'll start by just moving my apple roughly into place, and I think I might zoom in on this a little bit. And then I'll use my scale tool, which is the R key, and I'm going to scale this down so that they're roughly the same size. And you can see how I can get a really good idea of how these are positioned just by looking at this bird's eye view. If I come back out, I can come to my left view, and I can see that the height is completely wrong. So I can click on that, bring that up, and I think now that I've got it close, I might come back to my perspective view, and let's zoom in. what I can do is just nudge these a little closer to each other. There we go. So that's a good start, and that's making use of two different object types and using our transform tools to move them into place. In addition to using the freeform transform tools to do everything by eye, I can do it a little bit more precisely. If I go to the Edit menu and select Transform Toolbox, that brings up a set of tools that allow me to do all of the above, but a little bit more precisely. So I can pick up an object, and one of the features that I really like about the Transform Toolbox is it has this quick clone option. So I can make a quick copy of the apple, for example, by hitting Q clone, and it just puts it next to it and calls it Apple 2, whereas my first one was called Apple 1. If I wanted to change the size of this object, I can do that using the size option here. I can move it I can scale it in X, Y, or Z, or I can do it in all three together, which is what I'm going to do in this instance. Now you put the size in here and you can interactively change that scale, but a good starting point is the existing size of the object you have. So if you click on Put Current Size in Spinner, you'll have to actually click on a single dimension and it'll grab that for you, and then I'll go back to all, and if I wanted to scale this up, I just bring it up and click on Set Size, and you can see it's done that. So what I might do is just undo that and maybe just let's get that size again and just scale it up just a little bit, and I'll put this one behind that object. Now I can use the rotate tools here to quickly rotate my object around, and I can set the degrees that I want to adjust this by. I can also use this Aline Pivot option down here to actually adjust the center point of my object, where I'm moving it or rotating it from, or where I'm scaling it from. So if I set this to, let's see, minimum, and click on Y, you see it brings it closer to us in Y, or the minimum in Y. If I do maximum and click Y, it puts it all the way out, the furthest point out in Y. You can do that in all three different dimensions, or you can click on center to go ahead and put it back in the center. Clicking on origin will put your pivot point at the very center of the scene. So you're not restricted to the center of the object when you're doing these rotation and scaling operations. You'll notice how this rotates it around that new pivot point that I gave it. So let's put this back at the center point. In addition to the Transform Toolbox then, we also have what is known as the Transform Type-In box, which is found under the Edit menu as well. And this is essentially the missing part from this toolbox, and this is accurately placing or positioning the object in 3D space. So if I want to push this back, I can type in values here. I could adjust the Y, or I could use these spinners to interactively transform that object. So if you wanted to get everything very accurate, you can use this Transform Type-In box here. If I want to push it in, I can transform it in X, and so on. The difference between absolute and offset is that this is its actual position in 3D space. You can see it's 43.9, etc. Back in Y, it's up negative in X, and it's up 19 in Z, and it's across negative in X. And so if I were to type in a value in here, I can offset its current position. So if I wanted to offset it by just 5 units in X, I can just type in 5, enter, and it just offset that by 5. Essentially what it did was it added 5 to the absolute here. So that's the Transform Type-In and the Transform Toolbox. In this particular case, I think what I'm actually going to do is frame in on the selected object, and then I'm going to rotate around and just kind of nudge it into position. using the transform tools here. I think that's close enough. So let's go ahead and create the bowl for these pieces of fruit, and what I'll do is I think I'll just zoom out and go back to my create tab, standard primitive. I'm just going to create a standard sphere here. So all I'll do is click and drag to create the rough size that that bowl will be, and obviously we're creating a whole primitive here, but we're going to adjust this. We'll perform some simple modifications just using the standard rollouts that come with the object when you've created it. So let's rename it to bowl. I like to give them numbers in case I create more than one, and we'll give it a color. In this case, kind of a, well, don't want it to be too close to the orange, so let's pick that brown. And what I'm interested in is this hemisphere option here. Let's frame in on this so we can see it a bit better just by clicking on zoom extents of selected object. And you'll notice that if I adjust this hemisphere parameter, I can cut that into more of a bowl shape. So if I set it at 0.5, you'll notice that it's reduced it down to the shape of a bowl. We've got some extra faces here, so we'll deal with those later, but in the meantime, that's kind of a quick way to get started with that. I think I'm going to increase the number of segments because it's a slightly larger piece of geometry. So let's put it up to 26. Now the next thing you'll notice is that we've got to rotate this round so that it's the correct way up. So I think what I'll do actually is bring up my transform toolbox, and I'm just going to rotate this round a couple of times so that it's flipped. And I want to position this so that it's sitting on my virtual table. In this case, that's just the grid that I have. That's where my table's going to be eventually. So what I could do is just use my transform tool, just kind of move it into place roughly, or I could use my left view and I could align this with the grid. That flat base of my grid is this dark line here. But another way to do this would be to use snapping. If I pick up my object, you'll see this little magnet option up here, and we have different extents to which we can snap, 2D, 2.5D, and 3D. I'm going to choose the 3 for now, and what you'll notice is that it's kind of snapping to the grid as I move this around. And it snaps according to the axis that you've picked up. So if I pick on Y, it'll snap it in that direction, X in that direction, etc. If I want to make sure that I'm snapping my object in Z, the problem is it's pulling the pivot point down to the grid, which is no good in this case. I need the bowl to sit on the desk. Another option I could use would be to just move it in my left view, and then that'll get that so it sits nicely on my grid. But what if my object doesn't align nicely like that? What if everything doesn't come that closely together? Well, let's just move this under to demonstrate. We could come back to our transform toolbox and set our pivot point to minimum in Z, which would be the very bottom of this object. Remember, Z is the up down. So minimum, click on Z to bring that down. Now when I use my snapping tool, it'll place that directly on the grid, so it's all nicely in place. I'm going to reset this to center and turn off snapping for now, and I'll come to my top view, I think, and just move this into place so it's under my fruit. And for now that's pretty good. The problem is that we've got this these extra faces, and we'll have to deal with those now. So I don't want to get into it in too much detail in this video because I want to keep things just working with simple primitives at this point. But in order to do this, I actually have to modify the geometry beyond what the standard parameters, the creation parameters, allow me to do with this object. And in order to do this, I have to add what are known as modifiers, and you'll see this modifier list that's underneath the Modify tab. So if I click on that modifier list, the modifier that I'm interested in is known as Edit Poly. So I'll click on that, and that will apply an Edit Poly modifier. So I'm modifying it beyond the basic primitive. And I can then adjust the selection as to how I can pick up subsections of this primitive. I can pick it up by vertices, which are the points on the corners of each polygon, by edges, which are the lines that join the vertices, borders, essentially the border around collections of polygons, polygon or element. In this case, I'm going to select polygon, and you'll notice that what I can do is then click and pick up individual polygons on my primitive. I'll zoom in on the selected polygon and just bring that back a little bit. If I hold down Control, I can actually pick up additional polygons that I want to eventually remove, so I just keep on selecting these. So I've got all of those faces that I want to remove selected. All I need to do then is tap the delete key on my keyboard, and I've just removed those faces from my object. You'll see we've got some additional faces in here in this case, so I'm just going to delete those out. So I've got rid of all the ones I need to worry about, and you can see my bowl is created. So all I need to do then is take myself out of sub-object mode. I can just revert back to my scale tool. Maybe I'll scale the bowl down a little bit, and I can just select all my fruit by holding down the Control key again, W to come back to my move tool, and I'll just move the fruit around just a little bit. Perhaps move it up a little bit, just so it's not poking out of the bowl. And that'll do for this initial part. So I've created my fruit, I've created my bowl, and I'm ready to move on. The next thing I'm going to create would be the glass, and I'm sure you can already imagine how I'm going to do that. I'll just go to my Creation tab, and I'm going to create a cylinder. I'm going to create it from the, let's see, the center of the cylinder, and click and drag to create the base. Let go, and then I can create the height. So there's my glass. I don't need to worry about the cap segments, because in this case I'm actually going to remove that cap. I could adjust the, let's see, sides to make it a little bit smoother. Let's do 22, and in this case that'll do for now. I think what I'll do next is the same as before. Go to my Modify tab. I should probably rename it, so I'll call this Glass 01. Let's give it a slightly more interesting color. Let's see, let's do a custom color. Kind of a gray. And same as before, I'm going to add a modifier to edit it beyond a simple primitive. So Edit Poly, select the polygon, and just grab that top, and again just tap delete to remove that out. You can see I've created a very kind of basic glass. All I need to do now is come out of sub-object mode, and just move that back. Let's see, so it sits kind of to the side of my fruit. It's time we gave this something to sit on then, so let's come back to our creation tab and let's create a plane this time, because I don't need to worry about the sides of my table in this case. What I'd like to do is, instead of creating, kind of an odd rectangular plane like this, what I'm going to do is actually create a square instead. And to ensure that I've made that square at the very center of my scene, I'm going to come back to snapping. I'll start at the center of my scene, and you notice that square builds out from the very center of the grid. So I've created my table. Easy as that. Let's adjust the name. Let's call it table, and again we'll kind of give it kind of a darkish wood color. Lastly then, I want to create the paper airplane, and I'm not going to create it to any great detail, just again to keep this as simple as possible to begin with. So let's create another plane and see how we can adjust that very easily into kind of the shape of the top of that paper airplane. I'll start by turning off snapping, come back to my creation tab and build a plane, but this time I don't need it to be in a square, so I'll just keep it as a rectangle, and I'll just draw something that represents the overall width and height of that paper airplane. What I'll do is rename it to, ironically, just plane 01, and we'll give it kind of an off-white color, so let's do something like gray. And as I said before, you want to be careful not to include more detail than you really need. And because I'm keeping this really simple, I'm just going to turn length and width segments all the way down to 1. So it's just a simple quad, which is 2 triangles. I'll use my move tool. Let's bring that up a little bit so we can see what we're doing. Now all I need to do to kind of turn this into a plane is add the same modifier again, which will be an edit poly modifier, and this time I'll select vertices, and you'll see that those appear as little blue dots. And with my selection tool, I can just select both of those vertices at the front. Now you notice that my selection tool was set to fence selection region. It might be easier to just use the standard rectangular selection region, and if I have that, then all I need to do is just drag and select that region. I can just use my scale tool, which is the R key, and just scale those 2 vertices in to come to kind of a very rough point for my plane. Come out of sub-object mode, perhaps scale my plane in a little bit, and I've just created a very primitive rudimentary plane. I can just rotate this guy around. Let's do something like that, and just move it into place. I think that's close enough. Perhaps just sit it on the desk. And there you go. I've created all my objects that make up a primitive version of this still life that I have here. Perhaps the last thing I'll do then is just pick up the objects as they are, W for my move tool, just kind of move them into the center of the table. And there you go. A primitive still life. Last but not least, remember to save. And really you should be saving often, as many times as you can, so that you don't forget. And I'm just going to call this Still Life 01, and it's going to put it inside that Still Life project that I created, and click Save, and it's complete. So play around with the standard primitives in 3D Studio, get used to using the transformation tools, and also play around with these slightly more precise transformation toolboxes here. But don't just limit yourselves to the standard primitives, consider using some of the extended primitives as well. See what you can do by creating a chamfer box to build perhaps that desk with rolled sides, so it's got these beveled edges here. Remember to pay particular attention to the parameters that appear underneath each option that you of the object that you create, and also to name and apply a color to all of your objects so that they make more sense in the scene. But that's all for this video. Thank you for watching.